I have told this story before to Edmund himself on the night of his wedding, when the fire was low, and the champagne had gone warm, and he leaned back in his chair with the expression of a man who has finally, mercifully, arrived somewhere he had been walking toward for years without knowing it. He listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him, and when I finished he said only that I had embellished the part where he refused. I told him he had refused. He said he had expressed reservations. We disagreed, as we often do, and he smiled, which settled the matter. I am Thomas Alcott, and I have known Edmund Ashley, the Duke of Valdenmere, since we were schoolboys together at 14, when he arrived at Harrogate with his jaw set, and his trunk unpacked in silence, and a general air about him that said he did not intend to be anyone's particular friend. He became mine anyway, which I have attributed across the years to stubbornness on both our parts. I tell you all this not because it matters greatly, but because you should know who is telling the story. I am not a romantic man by nature. I am a practical one, which is perhaps why I saw it so clearly. I had no illusions to get in the way. It began with Lady Marchmont. Edmund's grandmother was a small woman who had outlived 2 husbands, 6 hunting dogs, and the patience of every matchmaker in the county. She had white hair worn in an impeccable arrangement and dark eyes that had not softened appreciably since approximately 1803. She was not, in the way that word is sometimes lazily applied to elderly ladies who involve themselves in the affairs of the young, a dear creature. She was a tactician. She had, in the spring of that year, written Edmund 3 letters on the subject of his continued bachelorhood, each more pointed than the last, and when those letters went unanswered, she had done the thing that the letters themselves had been designed to prevent her from doing. She had invited us all to Caldenver Hall for the winter month. Caldenver Hall was Edmund's principal estate in the north, a great stone house with more rooms than he had ever properly counted, a long gallery hung with portraits of ancestors who shared his jaw, and gardens that were spectacular in summer and rather severe in the January cold we arrived into. Edmund bore the journey stoically. He bore most things stoically. 3 years earlier, a woman named Miss Claribel Thorne had accepted his proposal of marriage, smiled at him for 6 weeks, and then contracted herself quietly to a marquis with a larger fortune and a better position of access to London. Edmund had not spoken of it since, and if I tell you that it had affected him, I can only say that the walls he built were not dramatic ones, no brooding silences or Gothic storms, but simply a very polished, very complete removal of himself from any situation that might require him to be hopeful again. He was 34 years old, and he had contrived to make 34 seem rather older than it was, by the particular method of treating everything that might warm him at a careful distance. It was, to my mind, the saddest kind of armor, because it fit him so well that most people simply assumed it was his natural shape. Lady Marchmont, who had known him since he was 4 years old and crying privately over a broken toy soldier, was not among those people. Lady Marchmont knew all of this. Lady Marchmont, I am increasingly convinced, knew everything. She had engaged a companion some weeks before our arrival, a practical decision on the surface, for she had recently dismissed the previous one over some misunderstanding about a chess game. And when we arrived at Caldenver to find said companion installed in the small morning room with a book open in her lap, and her feet tucked underneath her in a manner entirely unsuited to a formal introduction, I noticed 2 things in swift succession. The first was that Lady Marchmont's invitation of our party for a winter visit was not, as she had claimed in the letters, occasioned by loneliness. The second was that the young woman in the morning room was extraordinary. She stood when we entered, which she need not have done, and closed her book without marking her place, which suggested she had already memorized it. She was perhaps 23, with dark hair that had escaped its pins in several places and an expression that was difficult to read, not because it was blank, but because it was doing several things at once. She was composed. She was curious. She was, I thought, not in the least bit impressed by the arrival of a duke, which in my experience was either the sign of a very stupid person or a very interesting one. Edmund barely looked at her. I noted this. Edmund noted nothing, or appeared to. Her name was Elspeth Vane. Her father had been a solicitor of some reputation who had died 3 winters past, leaving behind him considerably more debt than anyone had anticipated, and a daughter who had managed her circumstances with, from everything I observed in those first days, extraordinary quietness. She did not speak of it. She did not seek sympathy. She did her work as Lady Marchmont's companion with a seriousness that I found myself respecting almost immediately, fetching what was needed, reading aloud when asked, managing the old lady's correspondence with an orderliness that the household had apparently been lacking for some time. She was observant in the way that people are observant when they have learned to rely on their own reading of a room rather than on anyone's explanations. She was also, I noticed, quite funny, in a dry and undemonstrative way that meant only the people who were paying attention caught it. She was not invisible exactly, but she had learned, as people in her position must, to occupy a room without pressing herself upon it. This made things somewhat difficult for Lady Marchmont's scheme. I know it was a scheme because Lady Marchmont told me so herself, over breakfast on the third morning, with the serene candor of a woman who has nothing left to prove. She said, setting down her cup with a small, decisive click, that she had chosen Elspeth with some care, and that she expected Edmund to have his eyes open by the end of the week, and that if he did not, she would simply extend the visit. I said, with what I felt was appropriate delicacy, that Edmund might not respond well to being managed. She looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as fond contempt. "My dear Thomas," she said, "I am not managing Edmund, I am providing him with a circumstance. Whether he has the sense to notice it is his own affair." I pointed out that Edmund had, in fact, barely glanced at Elspeth upon our arrival. "He glanced," she said, "for longer than he has glanced at any young woman in 3 years. Have some more toast." I had some more toast. I kept my counsel. I watched. She was not wrong, precisely. Edmund did not show his interest the way other men show interest. There was no particular attention, no hovering, no conversational gravity pulling him toward her side of the room. What there was, instead, was a quality of alertness in his stillness. Edmund is a very still man ordinarily, but when Elspeth was in the room, the stillness had a different texture, an awareness in it, a quality of someone hearing a sound at the edge of their attention and not yet turning to locate it. Elspeth, for her part, treated him exactly as she treated the rest of us, with courtesy, with some quiet warmth, and without any particular design. She did not seek his notice. She did not avoid it. She spoke when spoken to and was silent with a comfort that most people cannot manage, and when she had opinions, which was often, though she did not volunteer them uninvited, they were expressed with a directness that I suspected Edmund found either irritating or deeply refreshing. Possibly both. With Edmund, it is sometimes difficult to tell because his face when he is irritated and his face when he is intrigued are not so different as they might be in a more transparent man. The incident that shifted things happened on the 5th evening. Lady Marchmont had arranged a small musical gathering, nothing formal, simply a few of the neighboring families invited to dinner and an evening in the long gallery, where a pianoforte stood near the fire. It was the sort of evening that happens in country houses in January because there is very little else to do, and it was pleasant enough, with good food and acceptable conversation, and a widow from the neighboring estate who played the pianoforte with great enthusiasm and modest skill, which is a combination that requires considerable patience from the listener. Edmund had stationed himself near the window, as he prefers to do at gatherings, close enough to be present, far enough to be elsewhere if necessary. I was talking with a local magistrate about the state of the northern roads when I heard the playing change. Elspeth had been persuaded by Lady Marchmont, who persuaded her with the particular brand of gentle inevitability that the old lady employed, a pressure so steady and undemonstrative that you often did not realize you had been persuaded until you were already seated, to take a turn at the instrument. She sat with her back straight, and her hands settled on the keys, and she played for a moment or two with the correct, modest restraint of a woman who has been asked to entertain rather than perform. And then she apparently decided, or perhaps simply forgot herself, or perhaps simply could not help it, and the music she played became something else entirely. I do not have the vocabulary to describe it properly. I am not a musical man. But I know that the room went quiet in a particular way, not the polite quiet of people pretending to listen, but the helpless quiet of people who have stopped pretending anything at all and are simply there, held still by something they had not expected. It was music that had feeling in it, the kind that seems to reach directly past the ears into some other part of you, and it went on for some minutes in which no one moved or spoke, and the fire in the hearth behind her seemed to breathe more slowly in keeping with it. Edmund by the window had turned. He was watching her, not in the way he watched people generally, with the measuring consideration of a man who files information carefully away, but with an expression I had not seen on his face in years, an openness in it. Something that had not been armored in time. It was the expression of a man who has been reached in a place he thought unreachable, and who has not yet decided whether to be troubled by that or simply to allow it. It lasted only as long as the music lasted, and when she finished and settled her hands in her lap and turned to find the room looking at her, he had already reassembled himself into his usual composure. If you had not been watching him at the precise moment the music changed, you would not have known. But I had been watching. I have known Edmund for a long time, and I have learned to read the parts of him that he believes he keeps perfectly private. Elspeth received the room's attention without flushing or disclaiming. She thanked Lady Marchmont with a small nod and moved quietly to the side of the room, and within 2 minutes she was fetching a glass of water for an elderly neighbor, and the evening had recovered its ordinary motion. She had, I thought, no idea what she had just done to him. Or perhaps she had an idea and was choosing, with the same composed good sense she brought to most things, to let it settle on its own. Edmund found his way to my side approximately 4 minutes later. He said without particular emphasis, "She plays well." I said, "She plays extraordinarily." He said nothing more, but he did not return to his position by the window. He crossed the room instead, and I watched him come to a stop at the edge of the small circle where Elspeth stood, and I watched him say something to her. I was too far away to hear what, and I watched her look up at him with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite wariness, but something between the two, as though she was taking a measurement and not yet certain of the result. She held her ground. She answered him, whatever it was he'd said, with that characteristic directness, and he listened, and then, "And this is the part I treasure," he laughed. Quietly, briefly, almost as though he had not intended to, but he laughed, and it was the laugh of a man who has been caught off guard by something he did not see coming, and who finds, to his own surprise, that being caught off guard is not unpleasant. I turned back to the magistrate and the state of the northern roads, and I allowed myself a small, private satisfaction. Lady Marchmont caught my eye from across the room and did not smile, because she was far too practiced for that. She simply lifted her cup a fraction of an inch, in a gesture that I interpreted as acknowledgement, and returned her attention to the widow who was speaking to her about her daughter's prospects in Bath. The days after the musical evening were different. Not dramatically different, I want to be precise about this. Edmund did not undergo a visible transformation. He was not suddenly attentive or openly admiring. He was Edmund, which means he expressed things obliquely, through small adjustments that you would miss if you were not paying close attention. He began to appear at breakfast rather than taking it in his rooms, which was his usual custom when guests were in the house. He walked in the winter garden on 2 consecutive afternoons, which was unusual for January, and on both afternoons Elspeth was there, because Lady Marchmont had asked her to cut the remaining late holly for the drawing-room arrangements, and Lady Marchmont had a gift for timing that I found genuinely impressive. I did not eavesdrop. I observed from the warmth of the library through the window, which is an entirely different matter. Their first conversation in the garden was brief and apparently unremarkable. They spoke, they parted, nothing of significance appeared to have occurred on the surface. The second conversation was longer. I could not see their expressions from where I sat, only their postures, Elspeth composed and upright with her basket against her hip, Edmund with his hands clasped behind his back, which is how he stands when he is not certain of his next move. They spoke for some time. When it was finished, Edmund stood there a moment after she had gone inside, looking at the boxwood hedges with an expression that I could not read from such a distance, before turning and walking back toward the house with the particular deliberateness of a man who has decided something and is not yet certain he intended to. That evening at dinner he asked her directly, across the table, in a silence that fell between conversations, what she had been reading the day we arrived. The table went momentarily quiet, not uncomfortably, but with the slight heightening of attention that follows when someone does something unexpected, particularly when the someone in question has spent 3 years doing nothing unexpected. Elspeth said it was a natural history of the mountain formations of the northern counties, which she had borrowed from his library. He said he had not read it. She said she was surprised, given that it was his library. There was a pause in which I could see him deciding whether to be affronted, and then he said that she made a fair point, and asked what she had found interesting in it. She told him, clearly and without performing interest she did not have, for perhaps 4 minutes. The table recovered its conversation around them. Edmund listened throughout with the full attention of a man who is accustomed to being presented with things he expects to find unremarkable, and is finding this particular thing is not. When she finished, he asked a second question, and she answered it, and the conversation they were having existed, quietly, alongside all the other conversations happening around it, like a separate frequency that only they were tuned to. Afterwards, in the brief window before the party separated for the evening, I fell into step with Edmund in the corridor. I said without preamble, "You called it an insult." He said, "I did not use that word." I said, "You said the arrangement appeared to have a purpose that you did not consent to, and that you thought your grandmother was treating you as though you were a horse to be paired with a suitable mare." A pause. He adjusted his cuffs with more attention than they required. "I may have said something to that effect," he said. I said, "And does your view of the arrangement remain unchanged?" A longer pause. He said, "She is nothing like I expected." I said, "No, she is considerably better." He looked at me with the expression he reserves for moments when someone has said a true thing that he would have preferred to arrive at himself. Then he turned and walked away, and did not speak to me again until morning. What happened in the days that followed is partly what I witnessed, and partly what Edmund told me later in pieces across months. With the reluctance of a man recounting a battle, he did not intend to fight but is not displeased to have one. He had asked Elspeth, apparently, about her father's work. He had known something of the elder Vane by reputation, a careful mind, a scrupulous man, and the question had been, I think, an attempt on Edmund's part to understand the whole of her, to place it in order, to make sense of what she was doing here in his grandmother's house with her holly and her borrowed books. Elspeth had answered him without self-pity or performance, which he had found remarkable. That was the word he used, remarkable. She had said that her father had been a good man who was better at understanding other people's affairs than his own, and that she did not think this diminished him, and that she had made her arrangements accordingly, and did not intend to spend her life grieving what could not be altered. Edmund had said nothing for a moment. Then he had said that she appeared to possess a clearer philosophy of misfortune than most people of his acquaintance. She had looked at him with that expression, the one that was not quite surprise and not quite wariness, and said that she imagined he was not unacquainted with misfortune himself, and that in her experience it either made a person very rigid or very clear-sighted, depending on which way they chose to bend. He had not answered that, but he had not walked away either. This is the thing about Edmund that I think Elspeth understood before most people do. His coldness is not indifference. It is a structure built over something very warm, and when you press against it, not aggressively, not with a wedge or a stratagem, but simply with the patient, matter-of-fact presence of a person who is not pretending not to see it, the structure does not break. It simply becomes insufficient. He had been building and maintaining it for 3 years, and he had grown very skilled at it. And then here was a woman in his grandmother's house who held her ground without demanding anything, who spoke plainly without sharpness, who laughed at the right moments and was quiet at all the others, who had, entirely without strategy, pressed against the structure with the simple, steady weight of being herself. I went to speak with Lady Marchmont on the 9th day of the visit. She was in her sitting room with her correspondence, and she looked up at me over the rims of her spectacles with the expression of a woman who knows exactly what conversation is about to happen and has been expecting it for several days. I said that I believed her scheme was working. She said, "I know." I said that Edmund was not going to do anything quickly. She said, "I know that as well. He will take the time he needs to make up his mind properly, and then he will go to Elspeth as though he has always been certain, and he will be mortified if anyone suggests otherwise. We are going to let him have that." I said, "And Elspeth, has it occurred to you to ask what she wants of this?" Lady Marchmont set down her pen. She looked at me with an expression that suggested she found the question belated. "I asked her," she said, "before I invited your party at all. She said she did not know him yet and could not say. I told her that was sensible. Then I watched her for 3 weeks in the ordinary course of the household and determined that she has the patience to wait and the clarity to know her own mind when she has made it up. Those are the 2 qualities Edmund most needs in someone, and the 2 qualities he himself entirely lacks." She retrieved her pen. "I did not choose blindly, Thomas. I am 81 years old." I said, "You are a remarkable woman, Lady Marchmont." She said, "I have outlived everyone who underestimated me. More tea." I had more tea. It was 3 days after that when Edmund came to find me. He appeared in the library doorway on a gray Tuesday morning with his jaw set in the way it sets when he has resolved something and is not entirely comfortable with the resolution, but intends to see it through regardless. He said without preamble, "I am going to speak to my grandmother." I said, "About the estate accounts." He gave me the look, the one that means he has no patience for deflection and has noticed I am offering some. He said, "You know precisely what about." I set down my book. I said, "Then go." He stood there for another moment, which is Edmund's way of making space for an argument that does not arrive. It is his way of giving himself permission. I have always thought that brief pause where he checks whether anyone will stop him, and finding no one will, proceeds. I said, "Edmund, go." He went. I do not know the exact words of what he said to Lady Marchmont, because he would not tell me, and she described it only as satisfactory, which from her is quite nearly effusive. I know that it was not a long conversation, and that it apparently concluded with Edmund asking her, with whatever remained of his dignity intact, whether she had any understanding of Miss Vane's own inclinations in the matter. Lady Marchmont had said that she had a tolerable understanding, yes. Edmund had said that he was glad to hear it. And that, I believe, was very nearly the whole of it. He found Elspeth the following morning in the winter garden. He had, I suspect, planned this. Lady Marchmont had sent her there with some invented errand regarding the state of the boxwood borders, which was a thing Lady Marchmont had never previously expressed concern about, and I did not watch this time. Some things are not meant for library windows. He told me afterwards, in the way he tells things spare, steady, with details given reluctantly but given, that he had said he wished to speak plainly. She had said she preferred it. He had said that he had not come to Caldenver intending to alter the course of things, and that he was aware his grandmother had arranged several circumstances of the past 2 weeks with deliberate purpose, and that he had resented the arrangement initially, which was not something he was proud of, and which he wished her to know. She had said she was aware of that. She had said it without reproach, simply as a fact, the way she said most things. He had said, in that case, that he wanted it clear that whatever he was about to say was not the product of arrangement, that he had arrived at it entirely on his own terms, in his own time, against what had initially been his active preference. That it had surprised him, and he did not experience surprise particularly comfortably, but that he had found, over the past 2 weeks, that the discomfort was preferable to the alternative. She had looked at him, he described it as the clearest, most direct look he had ever been given, and said, "And what is it that you are about to say?" He had said that he found her unlike anyone he had met. That he found himself, and here, he told me, he had chosen his words with some care, because he did not intend to sound like a man surrendering, only like a man who had made a considered and deliberate decision, and who was not prepared to have it described as anything else. That he found himself entirely unable to proceed with the winter, and all the winters after it, without understanding whether she might be willing to make something of this. A pause, the cold air, the gray-white January sky above the trimmed boxwood and the bare rose canes. Somewhere nearby a bird moved in the hedge and was still again. She had said, "That is the most careful proposal I have ever heard." He had said it was the only one he had ever made that he had meant completely, and he would refine it if she told him what was missing. She had said that she had spent a good deal of the past fortnight wondering whether he was going to say something or simply go on standing in gardens looking at the boxwood, and that nothing was missing, actually, and that she would be glad to make something of it, as he put it. He had at that almost smiled. He had taken her hand. She was wearing her gloves and he was wearing his, and neither of them removed them, because they were sensible people and it was January and the ground was frozen. And they had stood in the winter garden for some time in a silence that was, by his telling of it, entirely sufficient. Not the silence of uncertainty or of things unsaid. The other kind, the rarer kind, that comes when two people have been walking separately in the cold, and have at last, without quite having planned it, arrived at the same warmth. The engagement was announced at dinner that evening. Lady Marchmont received the news with the composed pleasure of a woman confirming something she had known for some time. She did not say she had told us so, because she did not need to. She simply asked Edmund to pour her wine, which he did, and touched his hand very briefly when he set the glass down, and the gesture between them, between this small, fierce old woman and this carefully guarded man who was her grandson, had more warmth in it than most speeches I have heard. Edmund looked across the table at Elspeth. Elspeth looked back at him. They were not the sort of people who say large, sweeping things in company, but I saw what passed between them in that look, and I will tell you that it was more than enough. It was the look of two people who have, against some odds and through some necessary stubbornness and the determined scheming of an 81-year-old woman, arrived at the same place, and who intend, each of them, quietly and absolutely, to stay. The wedding was in April, at the small chapel on the estate grounds, with a breakfast afterward in the long gallery where the pianoforte stood near the fire, and the windows let in a watery spring light that was wholly unlike the gray January cold in which all of this had begun. Elspeth played before the meal briefly, with no particular announcement, simply sat and played as she had on that fifth evening in the winter, the music that had turned heads and stopped conversations and made Edmund, by the window, turn and begin, without knowing it, the last long journey of his waltz. Edmund stood beside me and listened with his hands behind his back and that particular expression that was not the face he showed the world, but the one beneath it, the warm and unguarded one that the world had very rarely been permitted to see. After the story I told him that night, the one he said I had embellished, he was quiet for a while. Then he said again, with a mild stubbornness that I recognized, that he had not used the word insult. I said that he had told me his grandmother was treating him as though he were a horse to be paired. He acknowledged this. I said that I considered it equivalent. He said that was debatable. I said it was not, meaningfully. He considered this for a moment, with the air of a man deciding which battles are worth the trouble. Then he said quietly, and with the slow, settled contentment of a man who is exactly where he should be, "She is better than I deserved." I told him that was not quite the right measure, that it was simply luck and good timing and the particular wisdom of an 81-year-old woman who had arranged a circumstance and trusted him to find his way into it. He smiled. "Yes," he said, and lifted his glass. "I suppose it was." Outside the window the April dark was soft, and from down the corridor I could hear Elspeth's voice, low and warm, saying something to one of the guests that made the whole small group of them laugh. Edmund heard it. I watched him turn his head toward the sound, the way you turn toward a fire when you have been a long time in the cold, and his whole face was at rest in a way I had not seen it in years. Some things, I have found, do not require embellishment. They simply require patience and the wisdom of a grandmother who knew her grandson better than he knew himself, and a woman who was willing to stand in a winter garden and let him find his way there. He found it. It was, as it turned out, exactly where she was,